Global governance or world governance is a movement towards political integration of transnational actors aimed at negotiating responses to problems that affect more than one state or region. It tends to involve institutionalization. These institutions of global governance, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the World Bank, etc., tend to have limited or demarcated power to enforce compliance. The modern question of world governance exists in the context of globalization and globalizing regimes of power, politically, economically and culturally. In response to the acceleration of interdependence on a worldwide scale, both between human societies and between humankind and the biosphere, the term global governance may also be used to name the process of designating laws, rules, or regulations intended for a global scale. Global governance is not a singular system. There is no world government, but the many different regimes of global governance do have commonalities. Definition. In a simple and broad-based definition of world governance, the term is used to designate all regulations intended for organization and centralization of human societies on a global scale. Forum for a New World Governance. Reasons for this forum for a new world governance. Traditionally, government has been associated with governing, or with political authority, institutions, and, ultimately, control. Governance, however, denotes formal political institutions that aim to coordinate and control independent social relations, and that have the ability to enforce, by force, the decisions. However, authors like James Rosenau have also used governance to denote the regulation of interdependent relations in the absence of an overarching political authority, such as in the international system. Some now speak of the development of global public policy. Adil Najam, a scholar on the subject at the Pardee School of Global Studies, Boston University, has defined global governance simply as the management of global processes in the absence of global government, according to Thomas G. Vice, director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center and editor of the journal Global Governance, a review of multilateralism and international organizations. Global governance, which can be good, bad, or indifferent, refers to concrete cooperative problem-solving arrangements, many of which increasingly involve not only the United Nations of States but also other UNs, namely international secretariats and other non-state actors. In other words, global governance refers to the way in which global affairs are managed. The definition is flexible as to scope. It applies whether the subject is general or specific. It is flexible enough as to reach. It applies whether the participation is bilateral, function-specific, regional, or global. These cooperative problem-solving arrangements may be formal, taking the shape of laws, or formally constituted institutions for a variety of actors, non-governmental organizations, private sector entities, other civil society actors, and individuals, to manage collective affairs. They may also be informal or ad hoc entities. However, a single organization may nominally be given the lead role on an issue, for example, the World Trade Organization in world trade affairs. Therefore, global governance is thought to be an international process of consensus forming which generates guidelines and agreements that affect national governments and international corporations. Examples of such consensus would include WHO policies on health issues. In short, global governance may be defined as the complex of formal and informal institutions, mechanisms, relationships, and processes between and among states, markets, citizens and organizations, both inter- and non-governmental, through which collective interests on the global plane are articulated, duties, obligations and privileges are established, and differences are mediated through educated professionals. Titus Alexander, author of Unraveling Global Apartheid, an overview of world politics, has described the current institutions of global governance as a system of global apartheid, with numerous parallels with minority rule in the formal and informal structures of South Africa before 1991. Usage. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of a very long period of international history based on a policy of balance of powers. Since this historic event, the planet has entered a phase of geostrategic breakdown. The national security model, for example, while still in place for most governments, is gradually giving way to an emerging collective conscience that extends beyond the restricted framework it represents. The post-Cold War world of the 1990s saw a new paradigm emerge based on a number of issues. The growing idea of globalization as a significant theme and the subsequent weakening of nation-states points to a prospect of transferring to a global level of regulatory instruments, upon the model that regulation was no longer working effectively at the national or regional levels. An intensification of environmental concerns, which received multilateral endorsement at the Earth Summit. The summit issues, relating to the climate and biodiversity, symbolized a new approach that was soon to be expressed conceptually by the term global commons. The emergence of conflicts over standards, trade and the environment, trade and property rights, trade and public health. These conflicts continued the traditional debate over the social effects of macroeconomic stabilization policies, and raised the question of arbitration among equally legitimate objectives in a compartmentalized governance system where the major areas of interdependence are each entrusted to a specialized international institution. Although often limited in scope, these conflicts are nevertheless symbolically powerful, as they raise the question of the principles and institutions of arbitration. An increased questioning of international standards and institutions by developing countries, which, having entered the global economy, find it hard to accept that industrialized countries hold on to power and give preference to their own interests. The challenge also comes from civil society, which considers that the international governance system has become the real seat of power and which rejects both its principles and procedures. Although these two lines of criticism often have conflicting beliefs and goals, they have been known to join in order to oppose the dominance of developed countries and major institutions, as demonstrated symbolically by the failure of the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference of 1999. Context. There are those who believe that world architecture depends on establishing a system of world governance. However, the equation is currently becoming far more complicated, whereas the process used to be about regulating and limiting the individual power of states to avoid disturbing or overturning the status quo. The issue for today's world governance is to have a collective influence on the world's destiny by establishing a system for regulating the many interactions that lie beyond the province of state action. The political homogenization of the planet that has followed the advent of what is known as liberal democracy in its many forms should make it easier to establish a world governance system that goes beyond market laissez-faire and the democratic peace originally formulated by Immanuel Kant, which constitutes a sort of geopolitical laissez-faire. Another view regarding the establishment of global governance is based on the difficulties to achieve equitable development at the world scale. To secure for all human beings in all parts of the world the conditions allowing a decent and meaningful life requires enormous human energies and far-reaching changes in policies. The task is all the more demanding as the world faces numerous other problems, each related to or even part of the development challenge, each similarly pressing, and each calling for the same urgent attention. But, as Arnold Toynbee has said, our age is the first generation since the dawn of history in which mankind dares to believe it practical to make the benefits of civilization available to the whole human race, because of the heterogeneity of preferences, which are enduring despite globalization, are often perceived as an implacable homogenization process. Americans and Europeans provide a good example of this point. On some issues they have differing common grounds in which the division between the public and private spheres still exist. In certain cases, globalization even serves to accentuate differences rather than as a force for homogenization. Responsibility must play its part with respect to regional and international governments, when balancing the needs of its citizenry. With the growing emergence of a global civic awareness, comes opposition to globalization and its effects. A rapidly growing number of movements and organizations have taken the debate to the international level. Although it may have limitations, this trend is one response to the increasing importance of world issues that affect the planet. Crisis of Purpose. Pierre Jacquet, Jean Pisani-Ferry, and Lawrence Tubianen argue that to ensure that decisions taken for international integration are sustainable, it is important that populations see the benefits, that states agree on their goals, and that the institutions governing the process are seen as legitimate. These three conditions are only partially being met. The authors refer to a crisis of purpose, and international institutions suffering from imbalance and inadequacy. They believe that for these institutions, a gap has been created between the nature of the problems that need tackling and an institutional architecture which does not reflect the hierarchy of today's problems. For example, the environment has become a subject of major concern and central negotiation, but it does not have the institutional support that is compatible with its importance. World government. Global governance is not world government, and even less democratic globalization. In fact, global governance would not be necessary were there a world government. Domestic governments have monopolies on the use of force, the power of enforcement. Global governance refers to the political interaction that is required to solve problems that affect more than one state or region when there is no power to enforce compliance. Problems arise, and networks of actors are constructed to deal with them in the absence of an international analog to a domestic government. This system has been termed disaggregated sovereignty. Consensus. Example: improved global problem-solving need not involve the establishment of additional powerful formal global institutions. It does involve building consensus on norms and practices. One such area, currently under construction, is the development and improvement of accountability mechanisms. For example, the UN Global Compact brings together companies, UN agencies, labor organizations, and civil society to support universal environmental and social principles. Participation is entirely voluntary, and there is no enforcement of the principles by an outside regulatory body. Companies adhere to these practices both because they make economic sense, and because stakeholders, especially shareholders, can monitor their compliance easily. Mechanisms such as the Global Compact can improve the ability of affected individuals and populations to hold companies accountable. However, corporations participating in the UN Global Compact have been criticized for their merely minimal standards, the absence of sanction and control measures, their lack of commitment to social and ecological standards, minimal acceptance among corporations around the world, and the high cost involved in reporting annually to small and medium-sized business issues. Expansion of normative mechanisms and globalization of institutions. One of the effects of globalization is the increasing numbers of rules placed upon businesses in the global marketplace. Jan Aart Scholter asserts, however, that these changes are inadequate to meet the needs. Along with the general intensified globalization of social relations in contemporary history has come an unprecedented expansion of regulatory apparatuses that cover planetary jurisdictions and constituencies. On the whole, however, this global governance remains weak relative to pressing current needs for global public policy. Shortfalls in moral standing, legal foundations, material delivery, democratic credentials and charismatic leadership have together generated large legitimacy deficits in existing global regimes. On another level, There is need to set up, in all spheres, an increasing number of networks and institutions operating on a global scale. Proposals and initiatives have been developed at various sources: political parties, unions, regional authorities, and members of parliament in sovereign states. Formulation and objectives. One of the conditions for building a world democratic governance should be the development of platforms for citizen dialogue on the legal formulation of world governance and the harmonization of objectives. This legal formulation could take the form of a global constitution. According to Pierre Calamy and Gustavo Marin, a global constitution resulting from a process for the institution of a global community will act as the common reference for establishing the order of rights and duties applicable to United Nations agencies and to the other multilateral institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. As for formulating objectives, the necessary but insufficient ambition of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which aim to safeguard humankind and the planet, and the huge difficulties in implementing them, illustrates the inadequacy of institutional initiatives that do not have popular support for having failed to invite citizens to take part in the elaboration process. Furthermore, the global constitution must clearly express a limited number of overall objectives that are to be the basis of global governance and are to guide the common action of the UN, agencies and the multilateral institutions, where the specific role of each of these is subordinated to the pursuit of these common objectives. Calamy proposes the following objectives: instituting the conditions for sustainable development, reducing inequalities, establishing lasting peace while respecting diversity, reforming international institutions. Is the UN capable of taking on the heavy responsibility of managing the planet's serious problems? More specifically, can the UN reform itself in such a way as to be able to meet this challenge, at a time when the financial crisis of 2008 is raising the same questions posed by the climate disasters of previous years regarding the unpredictable consequences of disastrous human management? Can international financial institutions be reformed in such a way as to go back to their original task, which was to provide financial help to countries in need? Lack of political will and citizen involvement at the international level has also brought about the submission of international institutions to the neoliberal agenda, particularly financial institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. Pierre Calamy gives an account of this development, while Joseph E. Stiglitz points out that the need for international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO has never been so great, but people's trust in them has never been so low. One of the key aspects of the United Nations reform is the problem of the representativeness of the General Assembly. The Assembly operates on the principle of one state, one vote, so that states of hugely varying sizes have the same impact on the vote, which distorts representativeness and results in a major loss of credibility. Accordingly, the General Assembly has lost any real capacity to influence. This means that the mechanisms for action and consultation organized by rich countries have the leading role. Gustav Massier advocates defining and implementing a radical reform of the UN. The author proposes building new foundations that can provide the basis for global democracy and the creation of a global social contract, rooted in the respect and protection of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as in the recognition of the strategic role of international law. The Brussels-based Global Governance Institute is dedicated to a more equitable, peaceful and sustainable global order. The three gaps in global governance. There is the jurisdictional gap, between the increasing need for global governance in many areas, such as health, and the lack of an authority with the power, or jurisdiction, to take action. Moreover, the gap of incentive between the need for international cooperation and the motivation to undertake it. The incentive gap is said to be closing as globalization provides increasing impetus for countries to cooperate. However, there are concerns that, as Africa lags further behind economically, its influence on global governance processes will diminish. At last, the participation gap, which refers to the fact that international cooperation remains primarily the affair of governments, leaving civil society groups on the fringes of policy making. On the other hand, globalization of communication is facilitating the development of global civil society movements.